Now, I told you on Monday that the state was going to try to paint you or write you a story. And I asked you to pay attention to the main elements of the story, the 5 W's as I call them. Who, what, where, why, and then how. The first thing that I wanted to start talking about was the jury instructions before I get into that. And each time we come back to my main slide, I have a snippet of the reasonable doubt instruction that you have, which is instruction number 16. That after a full and fair consideration of all the evidence in the case, or lack of evidence produced by the state, if you are not firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt, then you have a reasonable doubt and you should find the defendant not guilty. Now, Mr. Forney talked about some of the jury instructions, but I wanted to kind of highlight them from my end. So murder in the second degree, you've already read through these. Based upon the state's case, I do not believe that, 1, this happened on February 13th, that 2, Ms. Gowan died as a result of being assaulted by the defendant, and 3, that the defendant acted with malice aforethought. And if the state failed to prove any one of these elements, just one, if they fail to prove it, then you must find Sam Brammer not guilty of murder in the second degree. Mr. Forney also touched upon malice, instruction number 23, and you all have that, and you will have that with you back in the jury room. I wanted to highlight for you all that it is an act done out of hatred or with an evil purpose. And this has to occur while committing the alleged crime of murder in the second degree. This has to be an act done with so much hatred and such an evil intent that you must find Sam Brammer guilty of murder in the second degree. And ladies and gentlemen, they just don't have that. The second counts, instruction number 37, abuse of a corpse. Again, the defendant said, or the state says, on or about February 13th, that the defendant either hid or buried a human corpse, or failed to disclose the known location of a human corpse, and that he did so to the intent to conceal a crime. I submit to you, again, the state has not proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant has satisfied either one of these elements. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more throughout my closing. Count number 3, instruction number 38, is theft in the second degree, is what he's initially charged with, but you have also the lesser included of that. That the defendant took the property of another, and that he intended to permanently deprive them of that property. And again, I will submit to you throughout this closing that the state has not met their burden of proof to prove each element of this case, or each element of this count beyond a reasonable doubt. I had the snippet, which is the last paragraph of the reasonable doubt instruction on my home screen, but this is the full one, and again, you all have it. But I want you to remember what we talked about during jury selection. That a reasonable doubt is not all doubts, but it has to be of such a nature that you are firmly convinced that the state has proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt and the defendant is guilty of these counts. Remember we talked about the Tylenol example, how if you'd be a little bit hesitant, you would not give that Tylenol to your family. So when you are considering all the elements under all these charges, you must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you are not firmly convinced and you hesitate, then you have a reasonable doubt. And I want you to consider that this morning and well into the afternoon when you're deliberating. Mr. Forney showed you the verdict forms. The verdict forms I would like to highlight for you all are number 8, number 10, and number 12, which is finding Mr. Brammer not guilty on count 1, count 2, and count 3, respectively. So let's start with the first W. Who? Who have we heard from this week? I have listed some of the key witnesses. We have Mike Brockman, Detective Brannigan, Sergeant Boldra, Sergeant Doty, Special Agent Hout, Dr. Cruz, and Dr. Bond. I'd like to start with Mike Brockman. You all were allowed to take notes throughout this trial, and you are allowed to refer to them back in the jury room. I was also taking notes, so I'd like to highlight some of the things that Mr. Brockman talks about. When he is working, he nearly always traveled alone to pick up those parts as a part of his job. If he didn't bring back parts, it was rare, but it wasn't unheard of for his job to not bring back parts if he went into Council Bluffs to go back in Omaha and did not get whatever part he was getting. We have timestamps that you have received into evidence, but we don't have any specific clock out times. We just have the hour that he started working and the hour that he ended working. We don't know what he did that day, and Marcia Delavoye can't tell you exactly what he was doing back on the 13th, 14th, or 15th of February. She just can't tell you that, and neither can the state. The state made a lot of argument regarding that the police talked to Mike Brockman, that he had his story checked out. The police didn't do a lot of the same things that they did with Sam Brammer. They didn't send his phone for a CAS analysis. They sent Sam Brammer's phone, they sent Ilene Gowan's phone, but they did not send Mike Brockman's phone. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of the investigation in this case. The police zeroed in on Sam Brammer nearly from the beginning. And they didn't do a lot of the things that they should have done in order to prove up their case, to show you beyond a reasonable doubt that the person they're accusing of a crime actually committed that crime. We also have some video of Mr. Brockman dropping off Ms. Gowan's belongings outside of Sugar's the evening of February 13th. He told her he could stay 2 days. She didn't show up at his house, so he just went and took her stuff and left it outside. Ms. Gowan's presumably only earthly possessions. She wasn't there. He didn't care. He went and left them outside the back of a bar. But he hid it behind a cooler, ladies and gentlemen, so that was okay. They were safe behind that cooler. There was testimony, not only from Mike, but from Carol, that the house is always locked during the day. If Carol was out doing chores like she testified, then the house was locked. So there would have been no way for Ilene Gowan to actually go to that residence and pick up her belongings if the house was locked. That thought didn't cross Mike's mind. That thought didn't cross Carol's mind. So when she wasn't there, 2 days is up, I'm just going to go ahead and just drop her stuff off out the back of a bar. We heard a lot of testimony from Detective Brannigan, and I'm going to get into that here in a little bit. We heard testimony from Sergeant Boldra. Sergeant Boldra was the officer that was wearing the body cam during the welfare check of Sam Brammer on February 19th. Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Boldra voiced concern over Sam Brammer, but if you remember towards the end of the video, they really just wanted to talk to Sam Brammer again. They talked to him on the 15th, they talked to him on the 17th, they had him again on the 19th, and he was told, you are going to be committed whether you like it or not. Now you can go freely with us and we'll give you a ride, or you're coming with us, but he was going to be committed that night. And if you notice at the end of the video, Sergeant Boldra was making sure that Sergeant Roberts was aware that, hey, we have Brammer again if you want to go talk to him at the hospital. You also noticed in the video that while Sergeant Boldra was blocking up Mr. Brammer's truck before he took him to the hospital, that he had his flashlight, he was looking around inside, looking for a phone that Mr. Brammer was requesting. He testified he didn't see any blood. He didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Remember what Dr. Cruz said during her testimony. The laceration on Ilene Gowan's scalp, the one that reached the outer table of her skull, didn't fracture her skull, but it left a little bit of a dent on her skull. While it was on her head, it would have produced a lot of blood. I asked her, are we talking about a liter of blood, like the amount that a person would donate if they're donating blood to like the Red Cross? She didn't give us an exact amount, but she said a lot of blood. And Sergeant Boldra had the opportunity to be inside that vehicle on the 19th. He didn't know one thing that was suspicious or wrong, including any blood. Detective Fletcher also had the opportunity to look inside the defendant's truck a couple of days later. He didn't notice anything such as blood or anything else in that truck. He didn't notice anything suspicious. The thing is, in this case, they never asked Sam if they could actually go in his truck to look around. He cooperated. He gave 4, 5, 6 interviews. He gave him his phone to do an extraction. He repeatedly said in interviews, check my phone. I don't remember where I was, but you can check my phone and you'll know where I was. Law enforcement did not look inside that vehicle. And whether it was by consent or by some other method, if they wanted to, they surely could have. Sergeant Jim Doty. I made sure to take some notes, and again, these are just my notes. You're to rely on your own recollection as to what was testified during trial. Sergeant Doty spoke with Sam Brammer around May 3rd of 2023. This was 2.5 months after Ilene had went missing and 2 months after her body was discovered. Detective Doty specifically testified that he had information that the safe contained $1,200. You have in your jury instructions that statements from officers during an interview with a defendant are not to be considered evidence. The only thing that we know about that safe is Detective Doty or Sergeant Doty stating, I have information. He didn't tell us who. He didn't tell us when. He didn't tell us where. He didn't tell us any of those things. The last time the state showed you testimony or evidence that someone actually saw what was in the safe was from Nicole Skipper, Christmas 2022. A couple of months before this. Again, Sergeant Doty talked to Sam Brammer on the phone 2.5 months after Ilene Gowan went missing. And the fact that Mr. Brammer stated, my son sold some tools for me on Facebook Marketplace. We don't know what time frame he was talking about. We don't know if it was in March. We don't know if it was in April. We don't know if it was in May. You're allowed to determine the credibility of a witness. Justin Brammer and Nicole Skipper, the daughter and son of each of the individuals respectively, are in a relationship together. So you are allowed to weigh credibility when determining these things, ladies and gentlemen. Special Agent Hope. He had a pretty well-rehearsed testimony. He's obviously given that testimony before he'd like to enlighten you all that they've helped exonerate 6 people, in the United States in the 13 years that the program's been around. So he told you that he can only interpret the data that he received. And the data that he received was from the historical cell site information provided by the service provider, in this case, T-Mobile. That's all I can do, and he didn't try to testify about anything else. And just as the state said a little bit ago, the cell phones were traveling together in accordance with the video evidence that morning. There's no doubt about that. You shouldn't have any problem with that. I don't have any problem with that. Mr. Brammer drops Ilene off in the area of Mike Brockman's residence around 11 a.m. on February 13th. Just because Ilene's cell phone may have been left behind in the truck, an old 1999 Ford pickup, does not mean that her or her deceased body was traveling in that truck. That is only the cell phone, and that is the only evidence that you have. Now the state is probably going to bring it up that if it was only her cell phone traveling with the truck, then how did she text Sam at 2, 2:30, 3 o'clock that day? Again, this is an old truck. We don't know if it was locked. We don't know if you could just open the door. You don't know if Ilene didn't flag down a ride on Railroad Highway. You notice in the New Horizons auto video, there's about 5 or 6 cars that pass in that 2 or 3 minutes that you're watching. It's not an unbusy road. So the fact that the state's going to tell you there's no way she could have got a ride. She didn't have her cell phone. She couldn't have contacted anyone. It's definitely not outside the realm of possibility that she could have flagged down a ride. Gotten into Sam's truck and got her phone. The state has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And you know that there are more than one possibility that it could be involved with that cell phone. Dr. Kelly Cruz, I will talk about a little bit more, but you heard what she had to say. She is an unbiased witness from the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office. She is obviously a younger doctor, but she is still a doctor. She is still board certified, the same board certification that Dr. Bodden has. Dr. Bodden was glowing in his review of her autopsy. Dr. Bodden said, that he has rarely seen reports as good as hers. That he had no issues with Dr. Cruz's technique. That she went above and beyond. He said that she had excellent autopsy and procedure. He loved everything that she did right up until the points where it really mattered. And that was his conclusion. And the reason that he gave his conclusion or said that second opinions or second reviews are better than the original autopsy is because that second reviewer or person who takes a second look at it has more information than the original performer. You heard Dr. Bodden testify. He had police reports, same police reports Dr. Cruz had. He spoke to a member of Ms. Gowan's family, and he had her autopsy. Dr. Bodden didn't have anything more than Dr. Cruz had, and I submit to you, he had less than she had. So that brings us to Dr. Bodden. Obviously a renowned and well-known pathologist. Very good at testifying. He called Mr. Forney Hansen, which I think all of us got a good laugh about. But all that aside, he was not here to take this case pro bono or for free. He was paid $8,500 a day, which he testified was a reasonable amount of money for someone like him. He was paid $17,000 to render this opinion. And do you think that Dr. Bodden would have been brought in if he had the same opinion or agreed with Dr. Cruz's opinion? Going along with Dr. Cruz's opinion, Defense Exhibit 100, which is in evidence, is the Quality Assurance Report form that was signed off on by Dr. Jonathan Thompson, the Deputy Medical Examiner for the state of Iowa. He's been doing this, I believe she testified for 15 years. He reviewed everything that she did. You can look at the form yourself. Didn't find one thing wrong, didn't disagree with it. So when we're talking about second opinions and having someone else come in and review the work, it wasn't just Dr. Cruz. She had her quality assurance report signed off. It's not just her conclusion that Dr. Bodden is calling into question. He's calling into question the report as well. But we'll get into a little bit more about the pathologist later. Going along with some of the witnesses, and I think this is probably the best time to highlight some of the state's argument during their first portion. And that's something I'd also like to bring up, is this is the last time I'm going to be able to talk to you guys. After I sit down, Mr. Wilbur is going to have the opportunity to stand up and give you some more arguments. I don't get another chance after Mr. Wilbur to come up and argue against the points that he makes. So when Mr. Wilbur is up here speaking to you all, I would really appreciate it if you could maybe think about how would the defense attorney respond to that? How would Mr. Munger respond to the point that Mr. Wilbur is making? Because I won't have the opportunity to get up here and tell you the points that I disagree with Mr. Wilbur. So I just wanted to point that out before getting into that. But responding to the state's arguments about some of the other witnesses, there were some inconsistencies. So we have Justin Brammer said that Nicole reported Ilene missing on 2/13 at 9 p.m. If you recall, Sergeant Roberts said he didn't get a report until the 15th. We had Megan Preston and the text messages that were received in the evidence. She didn't respond to the text message questioning the identity of the person during that text message. If you look at it, it says something to the effect of, very grown up, very responsible of you. But now that doesn't sound like Ilene. Not in the moment, not when she was actually communicating, but later. There's been a lot of talk of this diamond stud earring as well. It is uncontroverted. There's no question that Mr. Brammer was arrested on February 24th for eluding, and he had a $500 cash bond on each count for a total of $1,000. He was bonded out for $1,000. So what do you do when you owe someone some money? Not just someone, your granddaughter who bonded you out. You try to pay her back. Best way you can. He was broken up with Ilene. He told you, or Emily told you, it was the final time they were not getting back together. So he had little items of value. And he tried to make it right with his granddaughter, pay her back. Crushed his 1999 Ford pickup truck, which if you've ever been to an auto recycler, you don't get a haggle about the price of metal. The state's trying to tell you that this was just done in an opportunity to get rid of evidence. Evidence that they had the opportunity to look at multiple times. Sam was trying to pay back his granddaughter, and he was trying to come up with that $1,000 any way he could. The state has also made comments during their arguments about insinuating, why would Sam drop off Ilene at her alleged rapist's house? You saw the video again, actually 2 more times. Sam said, I don't know if she's telling the truth or not. According to Nicole Skipper, it was a very unhealthy relationship. He doesn't know if she's telling the truth. He doesn't know what's going on. So the fact that the state is trying to argue to you that it makes no sense that Mr. Brammer would drop off Ilene at a rapist's house who had just raped her the night before, he didn't know. He does not know whether that's true or not. And he states that perfectly clear on the video. The state talked about Detective Dyer seeing Mr. Brammer rummaging around in that dumpster after he dropped him off after that interview. I don't recall Detective Dyer testifying to anything of the sort, but I want you to look back at your notes and see exactly what he testified to. Again, those are your notes and your recollection. Speaking of the video that they brought up of Sam Brammer at his apartments, at the Cottonwood Apartments, the state makes a lot of argument that he's now taking the safe out of his truck in a black bag and tossing it in a dumpster. You know what you don't see in that video? You don't see Sam running to and from the dumpster looking like he's extremely frazzled, like he just did something extremely worrisome. He's moseying back and forth. There are kids walking by. Elementary school just got out. There are cars going in and out of the parking lot. Don't you think that if he was destroying evidence, as the state said, that he might be trying to vigorously clean his truck instead of just moseying to the back, dropping something off, going back in, not in any real hurry, doesn't have cleaning supplies, doesn't have anything else? So these are just some examples of the state's argument that they're just arguing to you. They have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's something that you need to, again, consider. And I don't want to keep riding this horse, but you need to consider and hold the state to their burden of proof. That they must prove every element beyond a reasonable doubt. Talking about the eluding in the state's argument, that we don't see any smoke coming from that truck. There's no way that engine was blown. They also stopped the pursuit. We don't know what happened 4 blocks later. We don't know what happened 2 blocks later. We don't know. And again, they're trying to make this out that Sam was running from the cops with a guilty conscience. He'd already been interviewed 3 or 4 times. He was stopped at a Walmart by the detectives. And they said, we want to talk to you. And he obviously didn't want to talk to them until a 4th or 5th time. So then they called the marked patrol car to light him up. I'm not saying that eluding is great or that he should have run from a marked patrol car. But he just didn't want to talk to the cops that day. Going to the what in this case. The investigation was led by Detective Brandon. He sat up here, testified for quite a long time. Now, again, in the jury instructions, you're allowed to consider the evidence, direct or circumstantial, but you're also allowed to consider lack of evidence. And I just wanted to highlight a few things that I believe the state's lacking in their investigation. No camera footage from Omaha. We tried. It was deleted. We couldn't get it. They tried, and they couldn't get it. If they would have tried when this was a missing persons case, back when they knew 14 days earlier, they could have got it. This is something that they could have got. The fact that they're saying, oh, it was deleted, it's not our fault. No, they could have gotten it weeks earlier, and they chose not to investigate that avenue. No follow-up with witnesses who saw Ilene on February 14th. Again, Sergeant Boldra sat up there and testified. He said he took a report from Caleb Moore, and that report was that Caleb Moore saw Ilene at a food pantry on 34th and Broadway on February 14th. We heard no testimony from Detective Brannigan that he followed up on that lead. We heard nothing else. Dr. Cruz sat up here and told you when she spoke with law enforcement, there are multiple reports that Ilene was seen on February 14th. Just like with Caleb Moore, we heard nothing about these reports, about who had seen her, where they had seen her. We know when they said they saw her, which was February 14th, the day after the state is alleging this event occurred. We have no DNA evidence. You remember the autopsy photos? There were the bags on Ilene Gowan's hands. Both pathologists told you those bags were to preserve evidence. Dr. Cruz told you, I did fingernail clippings, and I gave them to the proper law enforcement agency. We didn't hear anything else about any type of DNA testing that was or was not done. You heard both Dr. Cruz and Dr. Bodden state that strangulation, and not the neck compression that Dr. Bodden is talking about, but strangulation is a violent act, and it takes time. Dr. Cruz said it takes about 10 minutes. So when someone is strangling another person, that person is most likely going to be fighting, clawing, trying anything to stop themselves from being strangled. And you would think that during any of that fighting, that she would have the DNA or some type of evidence on her hands of the person that is actually attacking her. The state's going to try to tell you can't claw someone when you're unconscious, but why would they take the fingernails and not run any tests just to make sure? Again, another lead that law enforcement did not follow up on this case. I've already touched upon the blood, no blood being found in Brammer's vehicle. Also, there's no blood on Exhibit 9, the coat that Ilene was discovered in. The state apparently has some theory that she was lying back and the gravity caused the blood to go to the back of her head and not end up anywhere on her jacket or in the vehicle or anywhere else. If they're going to try to argue that this laceration occurred outside of the vehicle, she was in that vehicle. And according to them, she was unconscious and unmoving in that Burger King parking lot, during that Burger King drive-thru. There would have been blood on that seat in the Burger King drive-thru if this blow had knocked her unconscious. We also have the flock system that Detective Brannigan spoke about. Detective Brannigan and Sergeant Roberts stated, we couldn't follow up on anything else because we were just relying solely on Sam Brammer's statements. We couldn't do anything else. You heard Detective Brannigan testify. I can put in a vehicle description. I can say, hey, it has aftermarket brush guards. It's got 0 taillights, as he said multiple times. And that system can find that vehicle traveling by any camera in the county. He said, sometimes we get, hundreds, maybe thousands of hits. But they know the suspect's vehicle. They know exactly what to put in that system to try to track this down at an earlier point in time. And they didn't do that. Burger King. It appears to be the state's theory, but they're going to come up here and tell you we have the alternative theories. If you don't believe one theory, but you believe another, you guys can all agree upon it. But the state is trying to tell you that Ilene Gowan was unconscious, unmoving in the vehicle at the Burger King drive-thru. That Sam Brammer was breathing and heaving and just looking like he was about to pass out from exertion. You saw that video. You can see that video again. Look at the video. You can see Ilene's leg and maybe her arm, and the fact that her arm may be up on an armrest is an unnatural position. The fact that she's not moving is unnatural. She could have been asleep, but would it not have been nice to have heard from the Burger King employee who was in that video? He was kind of bopping around. He was having a good time at work. He wasn't screaming, "Oh my goodness, there's a dead lady in my drive-thru. Oh my goodness, there's a lady who just got the crap beat out of her in my drive-thru. She's bleeding from her head. She's got bruises all over her face. She's got a tooth knocked out." No. We didn't hear any of that. I already talked about the fact that there's no historical cell phone analysis of Mike Brockman. And again, defensive wounds. There are going to be defensive wounds on a person that is strangling someone to death. A person, the state is going to try to tell you that she was passed out. They have no proof that she was passed out or unconscious. There are going to be marks on someone, probably their arms, when they are trying to choke someone, because that person is not just going to roll over. And you heard Detective Brannigan state February 17th, I didn't see any marks. I didn't see anything that was a defensive wound on Mr. Brammer. So those are just some of the things I wanted to highlight that were missing in the investigation. But it's not an exhaustive list, ladies and gentlemen. And it's not Mr. Brammer's burden to prove to you that he did not commit this crime. It's the state's burden to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that he did. So, where did this alleged murder occur? We got Sugars. She's live at Sugars. We got Dudley Court. She's live at Dudley Court. Levi Carter Park. You all recall Special Agent Haupt stating that they spent the two cell phones spent some time together at that park. And he specifically stated that was on the Nebraska side of Carter Lake. It wasn't on the Iowa side of Carter Lake. It was on the Nebraska side of Carter Lake. And that was directly before those two cell phones traveled to Burger King. They didn't take a circuitous route. You saw they went south and they went east. And it's of note that the arcs on Special Agent Haupt's reports does include some of Broadway where that Burger King is located. I believe he was testifying that it was at Brammer's residence, but those arcs, if you look at it, do include some of Broadway. We have the Brockman residence, and we have Trainer and Old Mormon Bridge Road. I don't know if you all recall, Detective Brannigan stated in that interview on 2/17, and let me pull up my notes so I can tell you what I have down. Detective Brannigan said, "You forget things, you know. I believe you, that people do forget things. I understand if I were to ask my co-counsel, Mr. Reedy, hey, what did you have for lunch on Tuesday? I would be willing to bet that he did not remember what he had for lunch on Tuesday. It's not something that it's misleading. When brought to his attention, Mr. Brammer gave them more information. He repeatedly stated, oh no, there's no way that I went to Omaha. But he's saying, check my cell phone. He just didn't believe that he actually went to Omaha on Monday. He thought he might have went on Sunday. He did not believe that he went on Monday. But obviously, he did go on Monday. So when the state is trying to argue that he never talked about this trip to Trainer, how it is so relevant that he never talked about this trip to Trainer. Ivan, 62 years old, Sam, 62 years old, he obviously drives around a lot. You saw the historical analysis. He just drives moves around a lot. And the fact that he went out to train her and there's nothing of it should be of no value to you all. But again, you're the triers of fact, and you are to determine what weight to give evidence. Old Mormon Bridge Road. Old Mormon Bridge Road. You again remember Special Agent Haupt's historical cell phone analysis. Not one single time was Sam Brammer's or Ilene Gowan's cell phone anywhere near what they deemed the crime scene on that report. Not one single time. The state's going to say, oh, then he must have left his cell phone behind. That's the only explanation. They had cell phone data from before the 13th until after Ms. Gowan's body was discovered. If at any time Sam Brammer would have made the trip up either to dump Ilene's body, or you know how they say that people go back to the scene of the crime a lot, to go back, see if anyone had maybe seen her body, the state would have told you that his phone was up there. It wasn't. They cannot place Sam Brammer at the scene of the crime. They say, oh, he turned his cell phone off for 58 minutes on the 13th. Well, I want you to remember, it was on for 21 hours after that. It didn't go anywhere. Again, I've talked a lot about the 14th, but I believe the state is just trying to make the argument that there was possibly maybe some testimony. I know Hadley Kava talked about the changing weather conditions and the fact that Ilene was discovered with snow on one of her legs or ice on one of her legs, that it had to have been on the 13th because it snowed late in the evening on the 13th or 14th or 15th. We don't have any testimony that tells you exactly when it rained, when it snowed. This is all just people's recollections. They took down the reports. We don't know exactly. I think there's a little bit of testimony, but it was an unseasonably warm and cold February in 2023. Temperature was changing a lot. If there's a shadow covering the lower half of Ms. Gowan's body, I'm sure that there would probably be some snow or ice left there, but we don't know. And they haven't, not only haven't they told us, they haven't proved to you that that was the case. The state is trying to argue that Sam Brammer killed Ilene Gowan because he was jealous, that he no longer had control over her and she had to go. We heard testimony that, yeah, they had some verbal arguments. There was no testimony that there was ever any physical assaultive behavior. People argue, no one's perfect. But we don't have any history of assaultive behavior. Sam Brammer was the one who asked Ilene to move out of his and Emily's apartment. It wasn't the other way around. If this was Ilene kicking Sam out of her apartment, I would argue, yeah, sure, he was mad as heck that he just was made homeless. But it's not the other way around, ladies and gentlemen. He asked her to leave. He said he was done with Ilene. So the fact that the state is now trying to argue there's a jealous motivation behind all this, it just does not add up. It does not add up that after they break up, the state's trying to argue he pawned this sentimental diamond stud earring. They were broken up. You heard Sergeant Roberts state at one point to Mr. Brammer on one of the interviews, things are getting more dire by the day. People who go missing, they're not heard from a little bit. It's not outside of the realm of possibility that they're gone. And that can affect someone, whether they were done with the relationship or not. That can affect someone. finally, I want to talk about how. And again, this relates to Dr. Cruz and Dr. Bottom's testimonies, respectively. I'll start with Dr. Cruz. You have a report. You can go through her report as much as you want. You can rely on your notes. The main highlight is obviously manner of death. There are 5 manners. Or I'm sorry, yes, there are 5. I apologize. Manner of death, how she was killed. She doesn't know. Cause of death. Homicide, suicide, natural, accident, unknown. Those are the 5 options she has. She could have chose homicide if she believed there's enough evidence. She could have chose that someone killed Ilene Gowan. She did. Dr. Thompson agreed with her as well. So when we talk about strangulation, we heard Dr. Bodden and the state talk about rear chokeholds, police chokeholds, and then all of a sudden, oh, we're not talking about chokeholds anymore. We're talking about a coat being grabbed somehow, and by grabbing that coat and putting it around someone, you're going to occlude, meaning completely shut off the blood flow from the carotid artery and the jugular vein on both sides of the neck at the same time without affecting the windpipe. By closing a coat around someone's neck. I don't know if you all have kids and if you put on the puffy winter coats, think about what type of force that would take to choke someone with the collar of a coat. There's going to be more evidence that a violent crime was occurring. You heard Dr. Cruz what she would expect to see in a case like this. Hemorrhaging of the soft tissue, bleeding of the soft tissue is what hemorrhaging is. She would expect to see broken cartilage, fractured larynx, fractured hyoid bone in the neck. She would expect to see petechia, which is the breaking of the blood vessels in the eyes, not only in the whites of the eyes, but in the other part of your eye. She would expect to see bleeding of the face. She listed off 15 to 20 things that she would expect to see, and she saw 0. Dr. Cruz told you she does not prefer to put undetermined as a cause of death on a certificate. It doesn't give closure. It doesn't do a lot of things that most people would prefer when you have a medical examiner examining the body. But she chose it, and she stuck by her opinion. She said that she read Dr. Ballin's report. She disagreed with it. You, as the state said, are allowed to bring in your common sense and experience in this case. And not only are you allowed to do that, but the state has to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that this is what occurred. So taking your common sense and your everyday experience, wouldn't it make more sense for there to be evidence of injury when there's an actual strangulation rather than some mysterious puffy coat preventing any type of injuries, but cutting off 2 arteries, 1 artery on each side, 1 vein on each side at the same time without touching her windpipe, without breaking her larynx, without breaking her hyoid bone? You are allowed to bring in your common sense. And 1 medical examiner from the state of Iowa said she doesn't know. She does not have enough information to determine. And that was signed off on by her boss. So like I said, I will not have the opportunity to come back up here and speak to you after this is over. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy lives. But this is a serious matter, and it deserves real consideration. And when you go back in that jury room and you start your deliberations, you have to be firmly convinced that Sam Brammer committed these crimes. Firmly convinced. Beyond a reasonable doubt. And I submit to you that you should fill out on each count that he is not guilty.